The courtroom was thick with tension long before the gavel ever struck. Reporters huddled in the back rows, pens poised and cameras ready, whispering predictions about what might unfold. Spectators shuffled in the wooden benches, their eyes darting between the tall mahogany bench where the judge would sit and the polished tables reserved for the lawyers. It was not just another day in court. It was the kind of hearing that promised fireworks, the kind that could shift careers, headlines, and even public trust in justice itself. At the center of it all stood the defense lawyer. He wasn't flashy. No expensive watch glittered on his wrist. No designer suit screamed for attention. He carried himself differently. Calm, steady, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the power of preparation. His papers were stacked neatly before him, his pen aligned carefully at the edge of his folder. To some, he might have looked ordinary. But to those who watched closely, there was something about his eyes. They carried a weight, of truth, of certainty, of someone who had faced enough storms to know when the lightning was about to strike. Across from him sat the prosecution, a younger attorney eager to make a name, whispering furiously with aides. But it wasn't the prosecutor who commanded the room's unease, it was the judge. The man in the robe leaned back in his chair, chin slightly raised, eyes half-lidded in a mixture of boredom and arrogance. He tapped his gavel softly against the desk, as though reminding everyone who was in charge. Whispers followed him everywhere, about his temper, about his thin skin when challenged, about how often his courtroom became less about justice and more about dominance. Many in the room already suspected that today would not be about fairness. It would be about power. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Court is now in session. The words echoed, bouncing against the high ceilings. Silence fell like a curtain, heavy and expectant. The defense lawyer rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. His voice, when it came, was measured. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, today we stand at a crossroads. This case is not merely about the charges written on paper. It is about truth, what it means, who gets to tell it, and whether it can be silenced. Some in the audience leaned forward. Others smirked, ready to dismiss his words as typical courtroom theater. The judge, arms folded across his chest, regarded him with thinly veiled impatience. The lawyer continued, "The evidence will show beyond question that what has been presented so far is not the full story. And when truth is only half told, justice is not done." The judge shifted, tapping his fingers now instead of the gavel. The sound was faint but deliberate, an unspoken warning. Still, the lawyer pressed on. "For weeks, the public has been fed a narrative," he said, scanning the room. "A carefully constructed story that paints my client as guilty before the facts are even weighed. That narrative is powerful because it comes from authority. But authority alone does not make something true. Truth is tested. Truth is proven. And truth..." The judge's hand shot up, palm out, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. "That's enough, counselor." The interruption cracked the silence wide open. Gasps erupted from the benches. Reporters jerked their heads up, pens flying across paper to capture the moment. Even the prosecutor froze mid-note, blinking at the sudden halt. The lawyer stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open. For a moment it seemed he might bow his head, retreat to his seat, and let authority have the last word. That was, after all, how these encounters usually ended, with power reminding truth of its place. But then, something shifted. The lawyer raised his head. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his eyes carried fire. He inhaled slowly, the pause stretching across the room, building unbearable tension. And then, in a voice steady as stone, he answered, "Your Honor, with all respect, truth doesn't stop because you interrupt it." The words hung in the air, electric. Gasps rippled again, louder this time, some sharp, some drawn out in disbelief. A woman in the back clutched her chest. A man near the aisle leaned forward as though he might leap from his seat. The reporters didn't write now. They stared, eyes wide, stunned at the audacity of what had just been spoken. The judge's face changed in an instant. The smug half-smile was gone, replaced by something else. Shock. For years, no one had dared to speak to him like that. No one had dared to pierce his authority with a line so sharp, so undeniable, that it couldn't simply be struck from the record. Yet here it was, echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Truth doesn't stop because you interrupt it. The judge blinked, opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. For the first time, the balance of power in the room wavered. The interruption, meant to silence, had only amplified the lawyer's words. Silence followed, but it was not the silence of control. It was the silence of awe. Every person in that courtroom knew they had just witnessed a moment, one that would not stay contained within those four walls. The lawyer didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply adjusted his papers as if to say, "I came prepared for this." He continued, his words now sharper, more deliberate. "This case is not about performance. It is about justice, and justice cannot be served when truth is cut short. So if we are to proceed, let us proceed with the full truth, not fragments designed to control perception." The judge gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. But he did not interrupt again. The spectators shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. Some smiled, some shook their heads in disbelief, and some whispered feverishly, already imagining how the story would sound when retold at dinner tables, in classrooms, in coffee shops across the country. Because they all knew, they had just seen the spark of something bigger than a single case. They had seen authority challenged and dignity stand tall. And yet, the real story wasn't just that the lawyer had spoken. It was why his words landed with such force. Why, in that moment, the truth hit harder than anyone expected. And that was about to be revealed. The courtroom was still vibrating with the aftershock of that single line. Some moments live only in memory, but this one felt immortal the second it was spoken. Truth doesn't stop because you interrupt it. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a challenge, a mirror held up to power, and the judge knew it. He tried to compose himself, adjusting his robe, lifting his chin as though the words hadn't pierced his authority. But his silence spoke louder than any command could have. He wasn't just annoyed. He was shaken. The defense lawyer, however, acted as though nothing unusual had happened. He shuffled his papers with calm precision, the faint scratch of the folder against the desk echoing in the heavy quiet. Then he continued, his tone unchanged, but his words now ringing with a confidence that no one could ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning slightly toward the jury, "every interruption you have seen, every attempt to cut this short, reveals something important. If the truth were weak, if it could not stand on its own, then perhaps silencing it would succeed. But when the truth is strong, it grows louder, the more it is pressed down." The jury shifted uneasily. Some looked to the judge for guidance. Others kept their eyes fixed on the lawyer, waiting for the next blow. From the back of the room, a reporter whispered, "This is history." Another scribbled furiously, her pen struggling to keep pace with her racing heart. Somewhere, a cameraman zoomed in, knowing this clip would be replayed across television screens and social feeds within hours. The prosecutor tried to object, his voice cracking through the silence. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is editorializing. This isn't..." But the objection was cut short, not by the judge, but by the audience itself. Gasps, murmurs, the subtle stir of people who had seen too much to pretend otherwise. Even the prosecutor, catching the mood of the room, faltered mid-sentence. His voice trailed off. He sat down. The defense lawyer turned back to the judge, his tone polite, but his words carrying a sharper edge. "Your Honor, I will continue, because justice requires it, and because interruption cannot erase what everyone here has already heard." Now, here's where the drama deepened. You could feel it. Power wasn't just being challenged, it was being redistributed. The balance in the room shifted, and for the first time the judge seemed cornered. He leaned forward, his voice lower, dangerous. "Counselor, you are treading a very thin line." But the lawyer didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply replied, "With respect, Your Honor, the thin line you speak of is the very line between justice and tyranny, and I will not step away from it." The words slammed into the room like a second gavel strike. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, claps stifled by hands, and one voice in the back whispering loudly enough to be heard, "He said it!" The judge's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. But he didn't speak. And in that silence, the lawyer continued, "This court is not a stage for ego. It is not a place where one voice dominates simply because it has authority. It is a place where facts must be tested, where arguments must be heard, and where interruptions cannot replace reason." The power of his words was not in volume, but in clarity. They were not just sentences, they were declarations, and each one left a mark on everyone in the room. Commentary-style narration might say, "Think about it. When was the last time you saw someone stand up, not just for their client, but for the very principle of justice itself?" This wasn't about winning a case anymore. This was about exposing the fragile illusion that power equals truth. And in that moment, the lawyer wasn't just defending one person, he was defending all of us. The judge exhaled slowly, his attempt to regain control visible in the tight grip of his hands. He tapped the gavel once, a hollow sound that echoed more like desperation than command. "Proceed," he muttered. And just like that, the courtroom shifted again. The judge had yielded. Authority had bent, if only slightly, to the weight of truth. The lawyer turned back to the jury, seizing the momentum. His voice softened now, drawing them in. When someone tries to silence you, it often reveals that you are speaking the very words they fear most. Ask yourselves, why would the truth be interrupted, unless it threatened to unravel what has been carefully staged before you? The jurors leaned in, some nodded. A few scribbled notes, their pens trembling. The prosecutor shuffled papers nervously, whispering to an aide. But it was too late. The moment was gone. Control had slipped through their fingers. The defense lawyer pressed on, layer by layer dismantling the prosecution's narrative. He pointed out inconsistencies, highlighted overlooked details, and reminded everyone in the room that silence was the enemy of fairness. And with every word, the audience's energy shifted from doubt to awe. Outside the courthouse, the story was already spreading. Phones buzzed with alerts. Social media posts carried fragments of the quote, "Truth doesn't stop because you interrupt it." It was trending within minutes, shared and reshared by people who had never even set foot inside that courtroom. But inside, the drama was far from over. Because as the lawyer built his case, the judge simmered. His interruptions had backfired, his authority wounded before cameras and witnesses. And wounded pride, when cornered, rarely retreats quietly. The question was not whether the lawyer had landed a blow. He had. The question was whether the judge would strike back, and how far he would go to reclaim control. That tension crackled in the air, every second heavier than the last. The audience knew. The jury knew. Even the prosecutor knew. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a battle for truth itself. And the next move would shock everyone. The silence that followed was unbearable. It was not the silence of calm. It was the silence before a storm. The judge sat stiffly, his jaw set, his eyes locked on the defense lawyer, as though measuring the audacity before him. The audience could feel it. Something was about to snap. And then it happened. The judge slammed his gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Enough!" His voice boomed, sharper than it had been all day. The courtroom jolted, the audience startled, some even gasping aloud. The lawyer froze for just a second, but it wasn't fear. It was calculation. He tilted his head, almost as though silently asking the judge, "Enough of what? The truth?" "You will not turn this courtroom into a circus," the judge barked, his face flushed. "This is my chamber, and you will show respect." Commentary voice. There it was, the attempt to regain control. But ask yourself, when power feels threatened, does it lean on reason? Or does it fall back on force? The louder the gavel, the weaker the grip on authority truly is. The lawyer inhaled slowly, then spoke with calm precision. "Your Honor, I respect this chamber. But respect is not the same as obedience to silence. Respect is honoring the pursuit of truth. And truth does not belong to one man, even if that man wears the robe." The audience stirred again, half in shock, half in awe. The tension was unbearable, but also magnetic. They couldn't look away. The judge's lips curled into something between a sneer and a warning. "You are dangerously close to contempt, counselor." The lawyer didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice steady, deliberate. "Contempt? The only contempt in this room is for the truth itself, and the people here can see it." Gasps erupted. The jury shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between judge and lawyer. A few jurors exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. He's right. For a moment, the judge looked ready to explode. His hand tightened on the gavel, knuckles white. But then he caught himself. He wasn't just fighting one lawyer. He was fighting an audience, cameras, and the viral world outside these walls. He knew every glare, every threat, every word he spoke could be replayed, dissected, memed, and judged in the court of public opinion. So he tried another tactic. His voice dropped, lower now, almost condescending. "You think this performance will win the jury, counselor? This isn't theater, it's the law." But the lawyer countered instantly, without hesitation. "The law, Your Honor, shines brightest when it is not hidden in shadows. If you fear performance, perhaps it is because truth, spoken plainly, always carries more power than control." Commentary-style reflection. Notice the shift? This wasn't just about an objection anymore. This was about philosophy. Authority versus principle. Ego versus truth. And in that arena, only one side could truly survive the weight of history. The jury was transfixed now. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching a showdown between ideals. Even the prosecutor seemed sidelined, his earlier confidence evaporating into nervous scribbles on his legal pad. Then, the lawyer did something that stunned everyone. He paused, walked slowly toward the jury box, and asked one simple question. "Why do you think interruptions happen?" The jurors blinked, unsure if they should answer. The lawyer let the silence hang, then delivered the punch himself. "Because the truth is dangerous, and when truth threatens the powerful, interruption is their only defense." The words landed like a hammer. The audience gasped again, one woman even clasping her hands over her mouth. The reporters scribbled furiously, knowing this was gold. The judge pounded his gavel again, shouting, "That is enough, you are out of line." But the lawyer was already leaning into the momentum, his voice unwavering. "With respect, Your Honor, I am not out of line. I am on the very line that divides justice from control. And this jury deserves to see which side of that line you stand on." The crowd murmured, louder this time. Some clapped before catching themselves, realizing this wasn't a rally but a courtroom. The energy was electric, volatile, and alive. The judge's face flushed deeper, but he didn't move to hold the lawyer in contempt. He couldn't. Not here, not now. Because the lawyer had turned the entire courtroom into witnesses of something bigger than the trial. This was no longer about legal arguments. It was about power being challenged in real time. And then came the twist. The judge leaned forward, his voice icy. "You think you can outmaneuver me, counselor? You think the eyes outside this courtroom frighten me? Let me remind you, justice does not come from applause, it comes from judgment, and I am that judgment." Commentary narration. Listen closely. Did you hear it? The slip. The revelation. In trying to reassert authority, the judge confessed something far more telling, that he equated himself with justice itself. But justice belongs to no one man. And in that moment, the mask slipped. The defense lawyer's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, standing tall, his words crisp. "No, Your Honor. Justice comes from truth, and truth cannot be interrupted." The room froze. That line, the callback, the perfect circle. It echoed louder than the gavel, louder than the judge's threats, louder than the prosecutor's silence. The audience knew. The jury knew. The world watching outside knew. The lawyer had just delivered another mic drop moment, and this one would be replayed forever. For the first time, the judge leaned back, visibly rattled. He tried to cover it with a cough, with an adjustment of his papers, but everyone saw it. The power had shifted again, and it wasn't coming back. Commentary reflection. Sometimes the most shocking thing isn't the interruption itself. It's what comes after. The exposure. The unraveling of authority when faced with words that refuse to bow. And that's exactly what was happening here. The judge's interruption had become his undoing. The jury sat straighter now, their eyes on the defense attorney, not the bench. The audience leaned forward, hanging on every second. And outside, social feeds exploded again. "Truth doesn't stop because you interrupt it," was already viral. But now, a new phrase joined it. "Justice comes from truth, not from authority." 2 sentences, 2 shocks, and a tidal wave of consequences. But the story wasn't over. The judge wasn't finished. Wounded pride rarely retreats quietly. And what came next would take the drama to an entirely new level. Because sometimes, when truth exposes power, power decides to strike back in ways no one expects. And the world would watch, stunned, as this courtroom showdown spiraled even further out of control. The weight in the air was unbearable. Everyone knew the exchange had shifted the ground beneath the judge's bench, but pride, once wounded, rarely surrenders quietly. The judge leaned forward, his knuckles pressed white against the polished wood, his voice cold, measured, and threatening. "Counselor," he said, his words deliberate, "you forget your place. I can end this trial right now. I can have you removed, stripped of your license, your career destroyed in an instant. Is that what you want? Because I assure you, my patience is gone." The audience gasped. Reporters scribbled frantically. Jurors stiffened in their seats. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Commentary narration. And there it was, the final card of power. Fear. Not law, not reason, not truth. Fear. But fear only works if the one being threatened bows to it. What happens when someone refuses? That is when power loses its teeth. The lawyer stood tall, his voice calm but laced with unshakable conviction. "Your Honor, threats are not justice. Removing me would not silence the truth. It would only prove it." The words landed heavy, echoing across the chamber. The judge blinked, caught off guard by the sheer audacity. For the first time, the courtroom felt like it was tilting, as if the weight of authority was shifting toward the defense. The prosecutor cleared his throat, attempting to break the tension. "Your Honor, perhaps we should return to the matter at hand," but no one heard him. The drama was too thick, the stakes too high. The courtroom wasn't focused on the case anymore. They were watching a clash of ideals, of man versus system, of dignity versus domination. The judge tried again, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You are walking on dangerous ground, Counselor. Do not mistake tolerance for weakness." The lawyer stepped forward, his eyes locked on the judge's. His voice was quiet now, but every word carried like thunder. "Weakness is not exposed by silence. It is exposed by interruption. And, Your Honor, the world has already seen your weakness." Gasps. A sharp intake of breath from nearly every corner of the courtroom. The judge's face went pale, then flushed crimson. He fumbled for his gavel, slamming it down repeatedly. "Order. Order in this court." But order was gone. Control was gone. The audience whispered openly now, the jury no longer afraid to exchange glances of disbelief, even defiance. The judge's own attempt at domination had unraveled into chaos, commentary, reflection. Do you see it? When authority overreaches, when it mistakes power for justice, the mask inevitably cracks. And once it cracks, there's no putting it back together. Not in the age of cameras, not in the age of viral truth. The lawyer turned to the jury, his voice steady, his tone respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here to weigh evidence, to listen for truth. Do not let interruptions blind you, because justice isn't decided by who shouts loudest. It is revealed by who dares to speak when silence is demanded." The jury leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. Some nodded ever so slightly, tiny gestures of agreement that sent shivers through the room. The judge slammed his gavel again, his voice almost desperate. "Counselor, you are out of control." The lawyer pivoted back, eyes locked on the bench. "No, Your Honor, I am under control. For the first time, control belongs to the truth, not to intimidation. And the truth is staring this court in the face." The room went still. Dead still. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of realization, full of history being made. And then, It happened. The judge froze, his gavel trembling in his hand. His mouth opened as if to deliver another scolding, but nothing came out. Nothing. He sat there stunned, silenced, visibly rattled in front of the entire room. Commentary voice. Think about it. The man who interrupted to silence truth, silenced himself. Not because he chose to, but because he was outmatched. Because when dignity meets arrogance, when principle meets pride, silence finds the one who tried to impose it on others. Cameras zoomed in. The audience held their breath. The jury locked eyes with the defense attorney, their expressions no longer neutral but inspired. It was over. Not the trial, not the proceedings, but the battle of authority versus truth. And truth had won. The lawyer delivered the final line of the day, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with quiet, unforgettable power. Justice, Your Honor, is not interrupted. It endures. The audience erupted, gasps, whispers, even muffled applause before the bailiffs could calm the room. Reporters knew instantly. This was the headline, the soundbite, the clip that would ripple across the world, and ripple it did. Outside, social media exploded once again. Justice is not interrupted, it endures trended within minutes. Hashtags multiplied. Commentators dissected every second of the exchange, calling it one of the most powerful courtroom moments ever captured on camera. Commentary narration. What makes a moment like this live forever? Not the gavel, not the threats, not the authority. It's the words that pierce through arrogance and speak to something larger than all of us. That's what people remember. That's what people share. And that's what makes truth unstoppable. By the end of the day, millions had seen it. The judge's interruption had backfired spectacularly, transforming into a symbol of resistance against unchecked authority. And the defense attorney, calm, steady, unshaken, became more than just a lawyer. He became a voice for truth, a voice for justice, a voice for everyone who has ever been interrupted, silenced, or overshadowed, reminding them that when spoken with conviction, truth always finds its way through. The screen fades to black, the narration cutting in one last time. Because at the end of the day, power can interrupt, but truth endures, and that will always shock the world. Call to action. If this moment struck you as powerfully as it struck millions across the world, do not keep it to yourself. Share this story. Subscribe for more courtroom dramas where truth collides with arrogance and dignity triumphs over intimidation. Together, we remind the world, justice belongs to the people and truth always endures.